as Paul has said, we're in the throes of developing a specialist competence matrix. So I thought we would, well, we thought we would take this opportunity to update you on where we are with it, because it is one of the objectives in our 3-year plan, both in the 3-year plan, which is just closed, and also in our new forward plan. So basically, work has been undertaken or being done on such a matrix since about 2022, when I worked on a project funded by Historic England, undertaken by MSDS Heritage, to review the current state of heritage crime training at that time. And as part of the project, we developed a series of skills matrices, and that's what we're hoping to base our CIfA competence matrix on. So in the next few slides, I'll just take you through some of the key elements of that project and then how they relate to the work that we're doing on our specialist matrix. So the project identified 6 main subject areas, which you can see on the slide. So introduction to heritage and cultural property crime. So that's really the definition of heritage crime. What are heritage assets? What do we mean by designated heritage assets, non-designated heritage assets, where information is found on those, and how to report heritage crime as well. We've got legislation and strategic context. So that's the legislation, well, UK legislation relating to heritage assets, but also international charters and treaties that also govern heritage assets and also cultural property. Preventing heritage crime. So there's been a lot of work done over the last probably decade or more in terms of preventing heritage crime. So it's really about investigating the different ways of prevention. So for example, we saw last year the launch of the forensic marking project for marine heritage assets and objects. And there's also work currently being done on, or has been done on, things like lead theft, etc. So it's all about sort of initiatives that are being carried out currently to help prevent heritage crime. We've also got securing and preserving evidence. So there is overlap with sort of normal, I say normal, it's kind of standard crime. So in terms of like graffiti, vandalism, etc., you get that across the board, but there are specifics relating to heritage sites and buildings. So this topic is really how do we secure and preserve evidence, which may be archaeological objects, for example, or fabrics of historic buildings which may have been stolen or damaged. So that's what that topic really is about. Enforcement and prosecution. So how do we build a case to bring to court, to prosecute? What are the sentencing sort of requirements that can be achieved for heritage crime? And then community engagement and volunteering. So how can we as heritage professionals and also law enforcement officers engage with the communities about heritage within their area and how they can help prevent it? So it's really about raising awareness and working with local communities. So that's what that topic is about. So those were the 6 main areas, like I said, we identified in the project. And you can see here in the slide that I've kind of broken them down into different topics, which I've briefly covered. And this isn't exhaustive. It's kind of more giving a high level of what we would expect to cover in each of those subject areas, or to see within each of those areas. And like I said, some of them contain topics which overlap with offences outside the specifics of heritage crime, and that particularly relates to gathering and preserving evidence. And there's also not the issue, but a difference between the law enforcement and management of heritage assets in terrestrial environments versus maritime and marine environments. The subject areas and the topics remain common, but the difference lies in the content. So UK legislation, for example, is different for marine heritage assets in many cases to terrestrial, for example, and also things like forensic investigation, storage of exhibits. There's sort of differences there. So how do we relate those sort of subject areas and topics to a CIfA specialist matrix? Um, it's quite it is a challenge and it will be a challenge, but I think we should be able to do it pretty well. You're probably all aware that there's four key areas in the CIfA competence matrix. So we have knowledge. So that's the level of knowledge for relevant areas of the historic environment practice and professional standards. Autonomy. So basically the level of autonomy or responsibility that an individual has within their role. Coping with complexity. So that's really the level of understanding an individual has of complex situations and decision making dependent on their role, and the perception of professional conduct. So the level of understanding that an individual has of the wider picture, professional standards and ethics, etc. So as a first sort of step towards creating our specialist matrix, we've mapped those identified subject areas across those four um, elements as a sort of a broad brush first pass. So in knowledge, we've obviously got the information that would be within an introductory subject area, so covering definitions, data resources, etc. Then we've got legislation, preventing heritage crimes, so those knowledge about the practical elements of prevention, enforcement and prosecution. There's obviously a level of knowledge there, and also in the securing and preserving evidence. So that's pretty straightforward. Uh, Autonomy, that's where we start to come into a bit more complexity, because dependent on the role of the individual using the matrix will depend on obviously how much autonomy they have in these various different subjects. So we might find that actually law enforcement officers would probably do a bit better in this element of the matrix because they're obviously boots on the ground and doing practical elements of investigation. And depending on their role within the investigation, they will have various different levels of autonomy. In terms of heritage professionals, you don't tend to find them getting massively involved in practical investigations, but there still will be an element that they might be involved in. So we'd have to look at the wider role if it was a heritage professional. And then you've got the same with coping with complexity. Again, similar elements in similar subject areas would come under sort of that umbrella. And again, that's going to be a little bit of a challenge as to how we figure that out across the various different membership types. And then perception of professional conduct. That's a little bit easier to handle because we're looking at big picture stuff and things like ethics and legal, not legal standards, but ethical and good practice will be slightly easier, I think, to put together something there. So you all know there's three levels of membership. So there's practitioner, associate, and member. So we're going to have to figure out how those different kind of subject areas can be mapped across those types. So who are we sort of aiming our specialist matrix for? Well, there's really two key audiences. So obviously heritage professionals, most of us here fall into that bracket, but we also want to attract our law enforcement colleagues. So that's not just police forces, it's fire service, uh, border patrol, um, so wider law enforcement agencies as well. So Historic England and English police forces identified several roles that you can see on the slide that would benefit um, from having a specialist matrix. So this work was done prior to setting up our SIG, so it kind of all dovetails in really. Um, so as part of identifying those roles, they also identified the levels of training and experience that you would need to meet the requirements of those roles. So once we've got the matrix in place, we can start mapping across those requirements from each of those roles to the matrix and hopefully make that pathway a little bit easier. And it will also help us identify training, well, help identify training offers that can be developed to meet any gaps that we identify or any additional training that we think actually we think it would be beneficial to have additional training in a certain topic. For example, maybe it could be in expert witness testimony, for example. As I said, heritage professionals don't really tend to get directly involved in criminal investigations, but there are exceptions to that, of course. So what will be appropriate for our law enforcement colleagues for the matrix won't necessarily be appropriate for heritage professionals. So we're mindful of that, and it's likely that we'll end up with a sort of two-tier skills matrix to accommodate for those differences. And the reason we want to get the whole kind of backbone of why we want to develop this specialist matrix and why we want to draw in more non-heritage professionals working in heritage crime is that we need them to have a degree of recognition and accreditation, uh, particularly if they're supplying or providing expert witness testimony in prosecutions. We want them to have confidence in the accreditation and their qualifications and their experience so they can provide that. And then that also means that the prosecuting bodies, so like CPS, etc., will also have a confidence in the sort of skills and experience. So that's kind of so that's sort of the main objective of the matrix, but it also has other implications. Like I said, it forms part of an accredited skills pathway for those involved with heritage crime in their professional roles. And like I said, it confers a level of accreditation and recognition to those roles. And then once we've sort of kind of drilled down into the different sort of topics and subjects that we want to cover across the matrix, that will give us a framework to develop a series of CIfA accredited CPD courses, which we've got in our forward 3-year plan. And as I started this year, Paul briefly mentioned, but we'll be going to be running joint events with some of our other SIGs. So we'll be running one with the Welsh group, hopefully in May or June. And our committee member, Jonathan Berry, is heavily involved with the Welsh group, so he'll be helping us to put that together. We're also looking at doing something with MASIG, so the Maritime Archaeology SIG, and also osteology, and that the osteology one will be centered around trafficking in human remains. So watch that space. And we're also hoping to develop either a standalone day event or as part of next year's CIfA conference of 2027 is having a practical workshop session looking at assessing and identifying risk on heritage sites and historic buildings. And that is going to be linked to guidance, which we're hoping to produce probably developed this year with the hope that we'll publish it next year, particularly for archaeological commercial companies and voluntary groups who are working on archaeological sites and may not have considered how they could be targeted for heritage crime. So we're hoping to develop guidance on how companies and groups can assess the risk for their individual sites and getting them linked in with their local police forces. As Paul said, we've also been helping to promote the Striking England Youth Cadet program, which, as Paul said, has been really, really successful so far. Our promotion, we talked to quite a few people, a few cadets at the emergency services response show, and I think what it demonstrates is that there's a clear appetite amongst our younger people in heritage. So not just through our Young Archaeologists Club, but we can also develop their skills in that area through other youth organisations. And I don't know how much I can say on this, but we're also, so members of the committee, myself included, are working with Historic England to develop a certificate in higher education in the prevention and investigation of heritage and cultural property crime, which is quite a mouthful. Um, so we're currently developing that. We're in throes of developing that. So we're hoping to have more information for you and hopefully be promoting the course probably over the next 6 months. And then finally, once we've got the matrix put together and approved, we're going to be discussing the creation of a register and panel of experts with the CIfA board. So that's really where we are in terms of training and skills. It has been slow progress for several reasons, but hopefully you'll see real progress on this year. So I'll say thank you and I'll hand you back to Paul.